like, sex is a biological thing. You're born a male or a female. But things like gender, that is masculine or feminine, are things that, like, from as soon as you're born, from the moment you're born, you're kind of socialized into.
He works the car, she the same. She's not here to think. Sits with a baby, discuss the news. She doesn't have political views. Little one can't get to sleep. Mama, my night dress, it's hurting me. Falls on her knees, what has she done? Never got the comfort, oh little one.
I'm not saying in the song that women are just brainless, mindless morons who haven't got opinions, but that's the way that they're dealt with in the media. And the whole of our society, because it is male-dominated, is really caught up in pushing us into these roles. So if you're born a girl, you're supposed to be feminine, and the society says that to be feminine is to be passive, is to be submissive, is to be emotional.
In language, like if you're a man, you've got to do specific things. I mean, like being masculine, you're not supposed to cry or anything like that, or show your emotions, whereas women are supposed to be like all passive and
there's
feminine.
Like a male stereotype, and the male stereotype is like aggressive, dominant, active, do you know what I mean? And like women are always defined in like relation to men, yeah. So women are what men aren't, you know. Men are like positive, and women are like a subgroup to men, you know.
Well, there were certain words which like you use, especially like, you know, slang, swear words, if you like, that you just use automatically without sort of thinking. But when you begin to realise those, I mean, like, I don't know whether you can say them. I mean, like a word like for instance, yeah. I mean, like that was a word that was brandished around a lot at school. And it was just, it's blah, blah, blah. But when you actually begin to think of the connotations, my mother one day picked me up on it, and I actually began to think, well, you know, that is pretty degrading, sort of like, word to say.
You know, there's all sorts of words available to describe women, you know, like there's big myths about oversexed women. They get called slags, they get called sluts. Do you know what I mean? Whereas it's quite natural for men to go out and chase women and be promiscuous, and it's like, you know, also what we were talking about, that, you know, if the girl does sleep with them, then she's a slut. If she doesn't, then she's frigid or whatever, you know. And at the same time, you've got this other thing, whereas it's like a feminine virtue to be, you know, pure and chaste. On the other hand, if you do carry on being pure and chaste, then you do get sort of called frigid. All we want to do in our songs is get people to question things that they might take for granted as being normal and natural, you know, which is what I think our culture is really headfast on perpetuating, you know. The songs kind of like just raise questions like, well, why is it like this?
A guard travels on all trains. He gives the right-of-way signal to the driver to take the train out of the station and generally sees that everything is in order. There he is with his flag and his whistle. Doesn't look a bit like me, does he, really? I buy these books for my nephews and nieces, mostly for my nieces, really. But although they're technically good and they're up to date, they show you the modern advanced passenger trains and things like that. They're very behind in terms of the people who actually work on the railways. There are no women working as guards or ticket collectors. In fact, one of her other railway books starts off, boys and men enjoy trains. Well, she likes trains and I work on trains, so it would be nice if they just updated them to reflect what's actually happening in the modern world. I've been working for about 18 months now, and I don't worry about the job at all. In fact, I really enjoy it. But when I first started, and I found that the language was so technical, you know, I'd never done technical subjects at school, so I couldn't cope with it, really. They were very good. They taught me all the terms. They were very conscientious about it, but there were things like trains are coupled and levers get called cocks, and that can be really embarrassing when you start. You soon get used to it. You have to use the terms, and those are the technical terms used on the railway. But it could be a bit off-putting, I suppose. Nothing much embarrasses me now, and, you know, people don't tend to make jokes about coupling and cocks in front of me. I'm sure they do in front of each other, but they certainly don't in front of me. Of course, the railways started in the 1830s, and they were built by men and created by men, and all the terms that were used were obviously masculine. Like you get a signalman, or trackmen, lampmen, even guard, which seems as if it's not meant for a man or a woman, is actually a military term. One of the women that I work with is training to be a driver, and they used to call people training to be drivers second men, and she insists on being called a driver's assistant, although some of the old railwaymen naturally fall back into using the old term. I think that as more women do these sorts of jobs, then obviously this kind of change will take place, and the railways itself will probably start to alter its language. It's starting to happen in the union as well. At the NUR, at the last conference of the NUR this year, there was a motion put forward to change the name of the union from the National Union of Railway Men to the National Union of Railway Workers, because after all there are thousands of women working for the railways now. I've been to many union meetings and other kinds of meetings, and I'm used to getting up and speaking, but of course you have to get used to getting up and speaking in front of men who don't expect you to do that. I mean, girls are simply not taught to get up and ask questions and speak their mind and make their points forcibly. And when there are a lot of men around who are somewhat louder, perhaps, than women might be together, it's even harder.
He might run through them. It doesn't make the argument.
I'm not trying to say they're not polite, because they are polite, they do encourage you to speak, but it's just a different atmosphere. It's an atmosphere that a lot of girls aren't used to. They're not encouraged to be aggressive or assertive, and that's what you have to be when you're with men, because they're like that. And if you're going to be equal, you've got to actually be aggressive and assertive too, and put your point across. I'd like to think that the next generation of girls and young women don't have the same kind of problems that we've had, that they can be assertive and they feel completely at ease in things like engineering and the railways. But I think it will take more than just changing technical language and putting pictures of women in books. I think it's going to take a change in the law. I think it's going to take things like British Rail having to take a certain quota of people in jobs so that you get more women on the railways and they're not a minority in certain jobs anymore.
journalists obviously think a lot about the language that they're using when they're writing stories, because it affects the language that we use ourselves in our own personal lives, and does affect the way that we do deal with other people and the way that we see ourselves. For that reason, our union, the National Union of Journalists, decided that they ought to lay down some guidelines for journalists to make them think more about the way that men and women were referred to in newspapers and magazines and books. So that the union produced this book, which they called the Non-Sexist Code of Practice. It's not used a lot by journalists, I ought to say, because I'm sure that journalists' attitudes are just as difficult to change as are the attitudes of people generally. And in fact, you can look at almost any newspaper, as I say, and find examples of the way that men and women are referred to in these very fixed ways. And I've got a few examples here from a local newspaper, where on page 2 there's a story about a boy who's just got a degree, and it starts off brainy Paul Johnson, and you just have to turn over one page and there's a story about a girl who's also just got a degree, and it starts off there, former beauty queen Penny Bartley. So once again, the boy is referred to by his brains and the girl is referred to by how she looks, although they've done exactly the same thing and they've obviously got exactly the same amount of brains and they've achieved the same thing. Women are quite often referred to in terms of their relationships with men, and this is a very good example of that from another local newspaper. And there's this very nice photograph of a happy bride and bridegroom on their wedding day, and the caption reads, "The daughter of Waltham Forest Crime Prevention Officer Sergeant Colin Ball was married on Saturday. She was Patricia Ball of Rouse Road, Buckhurst Hill, who met her schoolteacher husband through the Bancroft Rugby Club, where her father runs the under-17 team." So you know all about her father, you know all about the bridegroom, but you know absolutely nothing about the bride herself. It's as if she's some sort of figure who has no life other than the life given to her by her father and her new husband. So it's all the time pushing this image of women as people who are in the background, almost invisible, if you like. The point that we'd make is that although newspapers reflect real life, we also help to change real life. We believe that we change it. So as long as we're continuing to present men and women in these very fixed ways, then in fact society is going to change very slowly, and it's become increasingly important to me and to a number of other journalists I know to try to express through the words that they write their own beliefs in a more equal society, to give women a much more equal role.
I started working as a secretary when I was 17, when I left school, because I couldn't think what else to do. What you work with is the words that go from that office and the words that come into that office, and everything's done with words. And that's what you do, you type the words. So you become very aware of how, when you're writing to somebody important, and everybody assumes that it's a man that you're writing to, so they say, "Dear Sir," I would try and write "Dear Sir" or "Madam," or more recently I've been trying to do "Dear Madam" or "Sir," to try and challenge that assumption that it's always a man that's the important one. When I'm typing a letter to a woman, I always try and put "Ms," because that just says this is a woman I'm writing to, and it doesn't refer to whether she's married to a man or not. But some bosses don't like you to put "Ms," partly because it's often laughed at, and partly because they don't want women to start challenging those notions. So when I started playing drums and being in the band, obviously how I've come to view things affects what I do in the band and affects the songs that we write. So that when we write a song about language, that certainly comes into it.
Dear Sir, House of Lords, mankind, chairman,
start to listen to the words in the mainstream pop music business, then you start to think about it. Like the music in the Rolling Stones, the music that the Rolling Stones do is absolutely fabulous. But then if you start to hear the words, then it's absolutely ghastly, because under my thumb, a girl who has just had her day. It's great music, it's revolting words.
We wrote this song called Manpower, which includes a lot of the words that make us feel angry because they exclude women. When we started, we found no difficulty at all in thinking up a lot of words which proved the point. Things like Dear Sir, House of Lords, Man in the Street came to our minds immediately.
It comes from the basic way that everybody thinks without realising it, which is that men are the main actors in the world and they do everything, and women help them and aren't important. That's what that word sexist means. It's that assumption that everybody has, that men are the important ones.
I mean, like, a man would be amazed if he was called a chairwoman. And, you know, if a programme was made called The History of Mankind, or the History of Womankind, or The Ascent of Woman, then everyone would think, well, that's only about women. That's a specific programme about women. But when they call it The Ascent of Man, or all the words that we've just played in our song, then you're expected to fit yourself into that and put up with being a subsection of men, and necessarily a lower category. I think that's what those words imply.
Like a man, man-made, humanity.
The song will keep on growing, I'm sure. I don't think we'll ever have a finished version of it, because we continue to hear these words, and the more aware of them you are, then the more angry they make you.
Men are strong, men are tough, men are surly, men are rough. Men have mates, men drink beer, men are brave and don't show fear.
Men slap backs, men sing songs, men are men and men are strong.
Men don't touch, men aren't drifts, men shake hands with vice like grips. Men like fighting, men like cars, men like shouting with men in bars. Men like football and now and then, men like men.
No, they don't. Men beat up queers, men live with their mums for years and years.
Men have beards and hairy chests, men walk through blizzards in string vests.
Well, the song that we sing is poking fun at those images, basically. I mean, it's not, when we're saying men are strong, men are tough, you know, and we're doing those actions, I think that was quite amusing. I mean, I find those images quite amusing anyway, because they're so ridiculous, really. And that's just not me. I mean, it isn't what I'm like. You know, I mean, it's what every now and then I've tried to be like that and fail miserably, basically.
I mean, the song, I suppose, is providing a series of definitions about what men are supposed to be, what defines a man in our world, in our society, and we're just listing those and juxtaposing them, comparing them to each other. And the ridiculousness doesn't actually come out in the fact that we make jokes about what we're saying in that song. It's just that actually, when placed together, all those things that men are supposed to be are ridiculous and are contradictory.
Men wear trousers, men have flies, men kick sand in each other's eyes. Men stand alone and show no fear, men have hobbies and hairy ears.
Men have willies, men have bums, men are good at science and sums.
Men aren't loving, men don't dance, men don't change their underpants.
Because you're coming from that environment into that really
when you go to school, you're told that it's explained to you what masculine and feminine means.
Very, very simply,
and it's laid down in pretty strict guidelines. Like my first day at senior school, coming from a lovely warm junior school into a senior school in a different uniform, was the fact that all the girls were called by their Christian names and the boys were called by their surnames.
Yes, that's very true.
Immediately.
What does that actually mean?
What that means is that the girls are more personal with each other and with the teachers. It's a much closer you know, that being called by your first name, you know, if a teacher called me Robert, it was a completely different experience than if you called me Llewellyn, you know, you sort of, that's my name, you know, bang, and you're just like a soldier, you're like you know, it's not you, actually. I mean, that isn't my name, my name's Robert, you know, but all the women in the class were called, you know, Jill or Sally or whatever.
But also, wasn't it calling you by your second name, treating you like a man, whereas the girls were still treated like children?
Yes.
Yes, sure.
Very true, yeah. I mean, it worked, those things did, but the thing is, I think that comes out from that it does work both ways, in a strange way. I mean, it's all part of the same game, of sort of pushing you into that, into your category.
Immediately you're depersonalised, I think.
Sure.
And I think that's quite an important thing in the training of men, is their training in depersonalisation, which allows them to be brutal.
And it's all those continual proving. And I mean, between sort of 14 and 16, your identity is so sensitive anyway, that the slightest inflection that maybe you're gay, for example, is like, you know, and you go out instantly to prove that wrong.
Men like fighting, men like cars, men like shouting with men in bars.
Men like football, and now and then, men like men.
No, they don't. Men beat up queers, men live with their mums for years and years. Men have beards and hairy chests, men walk through blizzards in string vests.
Yeah, I think that, for me, a man is somebody who recognises their femininity, you know, because that's not trying to repress something in you that you may feel. If you want to cry, then cry. Why not? You know, if you want to be sensitive, if you want to talk to people in a particular way, do it. And why not? You know, and forget all the labels that go with that and about being Jessie or Nancy Boy or whatever you want to say. Forget it, because it's irrelevant.
When you talk about femininity, you're referring to softness or to gentleness, which aren't, what we're saying is they're not necessarily male or female traits, but they're traits that you can find in people. I mean, following that argument through, then I would say that if I was to be truly masculine, then I would be pursuing all of the masculine traits, which is strength, toughness, and that kind of thing. I don't think they are masculine or feminine traits. They're traits within people. And everybody has the ability to be gentle, to be soft, to be tough, and to be strong as well. And they're not necessarily masculine or feminine.
Men climb mountains in the snow, men don't cook and men don't sew.
Men are bosses, men are chums, men build office blocks and slums.
Men make bombs, men make wars, men are stupid, men are bores. Men ignore what women see and call our story his story.
Dear Sir, House of Lords, mankind, Chairman, Mrs. Strongheart, Masterpiece, Manpower, God's Man, Man of the Street, you man.